My sibling was always treated as the legacy keeper, but a hospital emergency rotation log revealed who was actually being groomed to disappear from the inheritance entirely. I still remember the exact moment everything started to feel wrong in my family. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a spreadsheet. A hospital emergency rotation log I only saw by accident while helping my mom print some documents for insurance updates. My older sibling had always been called the legacy keeper in our family, the one destined to inherit responsibility, leadership, everything. Meanwhile, I was always told I was support staff at best. Not in those exact words, but close enough that I grew up understanding my place. So when I saw my name repeatedly appearing in a hospital rotation log I didn't even know existed, I felt my stomach drop. Because it wasn't just a list. It was a pattern that suggested I wasn't being excluded from the inheritance. I was being quietly positioned for something else entirely. At first, I told myself it had to be a mistake. The hospital system my family used had multiple accounts tied to different relatives, especially since my parents ran a small but expanding private clinic network. My older sibling, Adrian, was the face of everything, the future director, the trained successor, the one who attended every medical board meeting, dinner, and shook hands with people I barely knew existed. And I was just there, helping sometimes, running errands, fixing small administrative things no one bothered to thank me for. But the log wasn't about admiration or titles. It was about emergency responsibility rotations. Who gets called first? Who gets assigned when something urgent happens? Who is listed as backup decision maker if my parents are unavailable? And my name appeared more often than Adrian's. Far more often, in a way that didn't make sense for someone who was supposedly not the legacy. I tried to ignore it, I really did, but the more I looked, the worse it got. Every entry tied to my name came with increasing levels of responsibility. Consent authorizations, emergency overrides, financial hold approvals, even temporary custody of administrative control during hospital audits. And Adrian's name? It appeared less frequently, almost ceremonially, like a placeholder rather than a working part of the system. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times my parents praised Adrian at family dinners, how they talked about him inheriting the vision, how they said I was good at support tasks, detail work, reliability. It always sounded like praise until I realized it wasn't. It was assignment language. The next morning I confronted my mom casually, too casually probably. I asked her why my name was in the hospital rotation log. She didn't even flinch. She just smiled like I had asked about the weather and said it was standard backup protocol. Nothing to worry about, but she didn't look at me when she said it. That detail stuck with me more than anything else, because my mother always looks at people when she's telling the truth. I started paying closer attention after that, and what I noticed made my chest feel tight in a way I couldn't explain. Adrian was being groomed for visibility, but I was being groomed for stability, for redundancy systems, for continuity when things go wrong, not the air, the fallback infrastructure. I started digging deeper into the hospital system logs whenever I could. I told myself it was just curiosity, but it felt more like pulling thread from something I wasn't supposed to touch. Every entry tied to me had a different tone, not celebratory, not prestigious, functional, operational, essential, the kind of language used for systems, not people. And then I saw something that made everything snap into a new shape, a note attached to a rotation update from 2 years ago. It said, primary legacy exposure maintained for Adrian, secondary continuity assigned to younger sibling for operational resilience. I read that line at least 10 times. Operational resilience. That phrase didn't belong in a family inheritance conversation. It belonged in disaster planning. I felt sick, because suddenly all the favoritism I had assumed was simple neglect didn't feel like neglect anymore. It felt like structure, a structure I was never meant to notice. When Adrian came home that weekend, I tried to act normal. He was always charismatic in a controlled way, the kind of person who knows he's being watched and enjoys it. He talked about a board dinner where people kept calling him future leadership. He smiled when he said it, not arrogantly, more like it was expected. I asked him casually if he ever saw hospital rotation logs. He frowned immediately, like I had spoken in a language he didn't like hearing. He said that was admin stuff and not for him. Then he changed the subject, too fast. That was my second clue, because Adrian always likes knowing everything, unless it threatens the version of reality he's built. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing small inconsistencies everywhere. Mom asking me to double-check documents Adrian had already signed. Dad calling me to confirm details after meetings Adrian attended. Even hospital staff who used to barely acknowledge me started responding to my emails faster than his. It felt like I was becoming invisible in public but hyper-visible in systems. And Adrian was the opposite, visible everywhere, but strangely absent from anything operational. One evening, I finally asked my father directly. I didn't accuse him. I just asked why my name kept showing up in emergency responsibility chains. He paused for a long time, long enough that I thought he might deny it completely. But instead he said something I didn't expect. He said, "You're the one who doesn't panic." That was it, no explanation, no reassurance, just a statement that somehow felt heavier than anything else I had heard. I pressed him. I asked what that meant for Adrian. He looked tired suddenly, like the conversation had aged him in real time, and he said, "Adrian is meant to be seen. You are meant to stabilize what's behind him." I didn't respond because I didn't know how that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the word behind. Behind what? Behind who? Behind Adrian, behind the legacy, behind the image, like I was not a person in the family structure, but the system holding the structure up. The more I thought about it, the more memories started rearranging themselves. Adrian always got praised at public events, but I was always the one called last minute when something needed fixing. I was the one who stayed behind after family gatherings to clean up paperwork confusion. I was the one quietly added to hospital access lists without explanation. It wasn't favoritism, it was allocation, and I had never questioned it because it was wrapped in family language. Love, trust, responsibility, but now it felt like something else entirely. One afternoon, I went back to the hospital admin system one more time. I shouldn't have had access, but no one ever thought to restrict me fully. That itself felt like part of the design now. I searched deeper into historical logs, and that's when I found a full rotation chart labeled Inheritance Continuity Planning Internal Use. My heart started pounding. It listed Adrian at the top, but not in the way I expected. He was marked as public continuity figure. Under him were responsibilities like representation, external relations, branding, and succession visibility. Then I saw my name, and everything went cold. I was listed under Operational Inheritance Retention, with subcategories I didn't fully understand at first. Legal fallback authority, emergency restructuring, asset stabilization oversight, administrative continuity holder during leadership transition instability. But the most disturbing line was the last one, primary inheritance continuity risk mitigator. I sat there staring at it for a long time because risk mitigator didn't sound like an heir. It sounded like someone designed to absorb failure, not inherit success. Absorb collapse, that was when it hit me. Adrian wasn't the only one being groomed. He was being displayed, and I was being prepared for everything no one wanted to talk about. The parts of inheritance that break, the parts that don't survive image. I closed the laptop and just sat in silence for a long time, because suddenly my entire childhood made a different kind of sense. Not cruel sense, not accidental sense, intentional sense, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that builds over years. The next family dinner felt different. I couldn't unsee anything anymore. Adrian was laughing with relatives, performing effortlessly. My parents watched him like he was the continuation of everything they wanted to be remembered for. But every so often, my father would glance at me, quick, measuring, like checking a system that was still running in the background. At one point, Adrian made a joke about how I was too serious for family legacy stuff. Everyone laughed lightly. Even I almost smiled. But my father didn't laugh. He just nodded once, like confirming something to himself. And that terrified me more than anything else. Because I realized in that moment that nothing about this was spontaneous. Not praise, not neglect, not roles. Everything had been assigned long before we understood it. After dinner, I confronted my mother again. This time, I wasn't casual. I asked her directly if I was being positioned to replace Adrian in emergencies. She looked offended, not angry, offended, like I had misunderstood something sacred. She said, "You're not replacing anyone, you're securing the family." Securing, not inheriting, not leading. Securing, that word stayed with me long after she walked away. Over the next few days, I stopped looking at the system logs, not because I stopped caring, but because I realized I was only seeing part of the truth, and I needed to understand what the full picture looked like outside screens and documents, so I started watching people instead. And what I noticed was worse than anything in the logs. Adrian was always invited first, but I was always consulted last, as if my approval was not optional but necessary, not for decisions to be made, but for them to survive execution. I started to feel like a failsafe no one wanted to name. One night, I finally asked Adrian if he knew anything about inheritance contingency planning. He laughed it off immediately, said I was overthinking things, said I was always the detail person who sees patterns where there aren't any. But the way he said it felt rehearsed, like he had practiced dismissing that exact question before. That was the moment I stopped trusting simple answers, because simple answers were too clean for something this layered. Weeks later, a minor hospital administrative audit triggered a temporary access review, and for a brief window, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. A full family contingency map. It wasn't about inheritance in the traditional sense. It was about continuity of operations for everything my parents had built. Clinics, investments, medical partnerships, legal structures, and at the center of it wasn't Adrian. It was a loop of dependency anchored around my name, not as heir, but as stabilizer node. Every branch of the system ultimately routed through me in crisis scenarios. Every fallback led back to me. Every failure path ended with my approval authority. I felt my hands shake, because it wasn't that I was excluded. It was that I was unavoidable, and Adrian was protected from that weight entirely. He was shielded from collapse responsibility, from system failure burden, from the parts that destroy people over time. I finally understood what my father meant by behind the legacy. I wasn't behind Adrian. I was behind the system that kept Adrian intact, and I don't know which realization hurt more, that I was being groomed for inheritance control, or that I was being groomed to disappear inside responsibility so completely that no one would ever think of me as an heir at all. Just function, just continuity, just the thing that holds everything together when everyone else gets to be seen. And for the first time in my life, I started to wonder if being called not the legacy keeper was the biggest lie I had ever been told, because I wasn't outside the legacy. I was what it depended on staying hidden. After that audit window closed, everything went back to normal on the surface. Adrian got another praise dinner announcement. My parents congratulated him publicly again. The family image stayed intact, but nothing felt intact to me anymore. I started setting boundaries quietly. Not dramatic ones, small ones, delays in responses, refusing certain administrative tasks, asking why me more often. And every time I did, the system adapted, not with resistance, with recalibration, like it had anticipated resistance all along. That was the moment I realized I was never being groomed to be hidden. I was being groomed to be stable enough that I wouldn't notice I was already inside the structure. The inheritance wasn't something I might lose. It was something I had already been absorbed into. And the worst part is that no one in my family thinks they did anything wrong. My mother believes she protected me from pressure. My father believes he prepared me for reality. Adrian believes he earned what he was given. And me, I'm still trying to figure out whether I was chosen or simply assigned. But I do know one thing now. Legacy isn't always who gets the name. Sometimes it's who gets buried inside everything the name depends on. And once you see that structure clearly, you can't go back to pretending it was ever simple.